Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined by Chicago's Loretta Nyhan, whose love of words have formed the plot points for a story that continues to unfold. Loretta read voraciously as a child. She earned an English degree, she wrote for trade magazines, she spent 20 years teaching writing to college freshmen, and then she decided to do things on her own terms. First came the two-part digital novel The Witch Collector, a celebration of her love for paranormal teen thrillers. Then, with Suzanne Hayes, aka Suzanne Palmieri, my long-ago sociology professor, she tried her hand at historical fiction. The critically acclaimed epistolary World War II novel I'll Be Seeing You, recently re-released as Homefront Girls, resulted, as did Empire Girls. In 2016, Loretta transitioned to contemporary women's fiction, or middle-aged coming-of-age books, as her editors call them, with All the Good Parts, the first of her novels for Amazon's Lake Union imprint. Digging In followed. Loretta's newest, The Other Family, came out in April and explores the emotional and physical impact of a young girl's autoimmune disorder on her family, including her newly single mother who discovers her biological family is the result of a DNA test. Kirk has praised, this engaging, plot-driven tale examines what it really means to be part of a family. Moments of self-doubt and embarrassment abound, but they are tempered by messages of hope and palpable love that hit just the right note. A captivating and uplifting tale about the essence of self-reliance and the unsung benefits of modern families. Loretta says she's a late bloomer. I say she's overachieving when it counts. Give a watch and decide for yourselves. Hi, everybody. Today I am in conversation with Loretta Nyhan, whose newest book, The Other Family, is out now from Lake Union, which is an imprint of Amazon. Hello, Loretta. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Of course. Thank you for being here. You're very brave. But
I don't know about that, but
I was going to say, you knew what you were getting into. Sort of, you've met me
yeah,
before.
I've known you for a
Um,
while.
So I promise that we will come back to the other woman shortly, but I did want to first get a little bit into your background because you have, done a lot in the world of reading, writing, publishing. You've sort of covered a lot of different bases, and I think that that background is very sort of fascinating. So the first thing I'm going to ask you seems obvious, but so many of us are passionate readers before we come to writing. So can you tell us a little bit about the books that made an impression on you as a younger person? Who those authors are, what those books might have been, and why you think they've stuck with you all the years?
Sure, yeah. When I was in grammar school, we had a great librarian, and I went to a Catholic school. Not a lot of money, but they had a wonderful library. And this woman introduced me to Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey twins and all these great little mysteries, and I became obsessed. And I just kept reading and reading, and I read probably things I shouldn't have read, some inappropriate things maybe, but whatever. But I just consumed everything anyone would give me. And then when I got a little older, when I got into high school, I started reading John Irving, and his work just blew me away because I thought I'd never read anything so human and so real. And the emotions that he was able to get out of me as a teenager, I thought that was pretty magical. So I was a huge fan. And I'm still a huge fan. So I read everything that he'd written. I was obsessed with. And I honestly, the regular stuff, Judy Blume, but I was just a reader. I mean, I would be at the breakfast table and I would be like, cereal box, I'll read that. Just anything, that I could get my hands on. I think most writers are obsessive readers before they even begin to think of themselves as writers. And I think you have to be, right? And you start out, when you start out writing, you mimic, you mimic people you love. I remember I read Ernest Hemingway and I really liked it, and all of my stories were like, so, every sentence was like very to the point and very direct and nothing like I normally write or would write. But you start doing that and then you slowly kind of find your own voice. but it's those first books that kind of just blow you away, and that was so The World According to Garp, wonderful book. Everything, Cider House Rules, everything, John Irving. And I was a big Jack Kerouac fan in high school, and I liked that kind of immediacy of his writing. Um, and then I went to college, and I had kind of like a summer session where I stayed on campus, and it was really boring because there was no one there. And I was like, what am I going to do? Okay, I'm going to like be really sophisticated, and I'm going to go to the library, and I'm going to get the complete works of Shakespeare, and I'm going to read every play. Okay, so I went to the library and went right past Shakespeare, and I went to Neil Simon, and I read every Neil Simon play and learned how to write comedy, or learned how to comedic writing. And I'm not a comedian, but my books have a lot of humor in them. And it requires timing, and it's harder to write comedy, I think, than dramatic scenes. So Neil Simon had a huge influence on me, and I plowed through everything he ever written in the summer, and it changed my writing, changed my life.
Sure. So I'm going to go off script as I tend to do, but I'll come back to your backstory in a second. But I just want to ask you, I know, a lot of readers who become writers then find, when they're on and they have publishing contracts, that reading sometimes isn't as enjoyable for them, or they can't read the same way that they did before, or they just simply don't have the time to read like they did. Do you find that?
Yeah, I think everybody does. Well, for me, when I'm in the throes of writing a book, I can't read anybody else's work because I'm afraid. I'm afraid that I'll start writing like them. So I don't, for the most part. But yeah, you get pickier. You get pickier. And then if you're lucky enough to achieve any kind of success, people start to ask you to read their books for blurbs.
Right.
And and I believe you need to give back like that. I was lucky enough with my first novel that I had some established writers agree to blurb it. It was wonderful. It gives you that jolt of confidence, and I feel like all writers need to give that back to new writers. So so there's always kind of like a stack of books that I need to read for blurbs, and so that takes some time. But yeah, it's just different. It's just different because you're also a little pickier.
Right.
You're kind of
Sure.
you don't want to be negative or critical, but at the same time, you kind of know how things work in a book and know how to put one together. So when you're reading something, you're just like, oh, why did they make that choice? Why did they do that? So it kind of, doesn't ruin the experience, but it can definitely put a damper on it.
Sure.
So yeah. I tend to be loyal to, like, there are certain writers that, oh, she's got a new book out. Yeah, I'm buying that without even,
Right.
I was earlier, I just got the new Kristen Higgins, and she's a must buy.
Yeah, she's
She's
great.
got a new book out, I'm going to get it. So there are certain people like that, who I feel that way about, but yeah, I definitely do a lot less reading now that I'm a writer.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons I write less creatively is because I've talked to so many people who, miss having the hours and hours to fall into a book. And like, that's the one thing that I can't give up. Or, a lot of the writing that I do is either book reviews or profiling, which means that I have to read the book. And then when my wife catches me in bed in like the middle of the day with a book, I can honestly say that I'm working. Um, but it keeps me reading, which is great, because I think that's the one thing that I probably couldn't give up. And like you said, when you have such a little time, you really have to figure out who and what you like. And
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, there are downsides to that, that the joy of discovering a new author when you just kind of fall in love with the way they put words together and with their story. I don't get that as often as I used to, and that's a shame.
yeah.
But when it does happen, it's awesome.
And you gift us with your books, so that's the trade-off. We might benefit more from it, but it's beautiful thing. So let me ask you, so out of college, you actually, I think you began your career in the trade magazines, right?
I
So
did.
can you talk a little bit about that experience and what you found to be transferable from that, either, in a writing sense, a discipline sense, what you were able to take from that experience to bring to your fiction?
Sure thing. I graduated from college into a recession. in 1992. Did I know what recession meant? No. I just knew that
You knew
I
you were in it.
really hard to find a job,
Yeah.
especially with an English degree. I had an English degree, but no teaching certificate, which
Right.
was really brilliant on my part. So, so I moved to New York without knowing what I was going to do, and through a cousin's wife's friend, something like that, I got a job working as a receptionist for a media company that had. Do you remember Tiger Beat magazine?
Oh
And
yeah, of course. Yeah.
so they owned that, and they owned the National Enquirer and the Star, and they and they owned a bunch of trade magazines, and then they owned I don't know if you're probably too young to remember, like True Confessions, True Story.
Sure. I wish I was too young to remember.
Yeah.
I should just lie. I don't know what you're talking about.
What are you talking about? So anyway, I was a receptionist, and it wasn't a super exciting job. And one day they were like, "Well, you look bored. Will you write the rejection letters for people who write into these magazines, True Story, True Confessions?" And I said to the girl, "It's just a form rejection. Send it back to them." So I was like, "Okay." So I started reading all these stories, and they broke my heart. They were just such emotional, such trauma, and I felt really bad sending a form rejection. So I'd
Mhm.
write letters back to them. And someone noticed and said, "You like to write?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Well, the trade magazine needs a writer, but you have to try out for it. And you're going to be up against like 30 people. And we're going to give you who, what, where, when, why, and you have to write a news story." Okay. So I did it, and I got it. So I worked for 3 years for trade magazines covering retail, and it taught me so much. It taught me economy of writing. It taught me how to proofread my stuff as I go. I mean, the editing experience. I mean, I use those skills all the time. It taught me to not get attached to my words. It taught me to kill my darlings. Like, okay, you know what? Your story's 600 words. It can only be 400. Deal. Okay, chop.
Sure.
So those skills absolutely helped when I started writing fiction.
It's
Yeah.
great. Yeah, kill your darlings. I figure every time I write something that I like, I'm like, I might as well just take it out now. Get it out. Uh,
Don't get attached.
I
Yeah.
know, right? And you did teach writing to, I think, college freshmen at one point, right? So
For almost 20 years.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a
Yeah.
long time. That's a
A long time.
little
Yeah.
investment of time. So let me ask you, you're either going to really like this question or really not like this question.
I
But I'm
like that.
always intrigued to get perspectives on this from people who've taught. So what do you think, in your personal opinion, what of writing can be taught? What is intrinsic? And how does sort of tenacity play into the equation?
I can't teach voice. Um, I can try to encourage it.
Sure.
I can tell someone, why are you the one to write this story? You need to write the story only you can write. What does that mean to you? But I can't, there's no amount of practice, unfortunately, that's going to give someone that. People can learn mechanics, they can learn how to put a story together. They could have a really great sense of storytelling, but no voice.
Mhm.
So I don't think that can be taught. And I actually, when I went to grad school, after working in the trade magazines, I went back to school, and I had to decide if I was going to go the teaching way or the MFA way. And I
Right.
went the teaching way,
Mm.
partially because I was scared. I was scared to show people my work, but partially because I was like, can that really be taught?
Right.
Worried that all of that critiquing, all that workshopping would do something to me or change who I was when I was writing. And people will disagree with me, but I think I was right. I think that was kind of the right path to take. Um, so who knows? I could have
Yeah.
been a different kind of writer if I'd gone to
No, for
to
sure, it's a grand
MI.
adventure, but I think there's something to be said for that because you sort of alluded to there's sort of the two schools of thoughts when it comes to the MFA, and I've known people who basically said I feel like you said I was workshopped and critiqued so much that I feel like I lost my voice and I don't know how to get it back. And then on the other hand, there are people who think that it was really critical to their development. So I guess yeah, it really does come down to personal choice and whether or not you think it's the
Right.
right thing for you to do. But so let me ask, so you did, eventually transition to writing fiction in your first works were like paranormal teen thrillers. It was The Witch Collector parts 1 and 2.
Mhm.
So can you tell me a little bit about, what drew you to that, why that was something that you wanted to explore? Because I think, YA fiction is great. And I think paranormal, you can be so, so very creative with that. But some people looking at your more recent books might think, huh, where'd that come from?
Well, yeah, and it's all kind of like I'm guided by my just various interests. But I wrote when my youngest went to kindergarten, and I had the day to myself because I taught night school. I said, okay, you know what? You've always wanted to do this. Either you're going to do it or you're not. And so I decided to do it, and I wrote a book that never saw the light of day, never sold, but it did get me an agent. And when we were talking, she said, I think you should stick with YA for now because I've always felt like I wanted to write both adult and young adult. Um, and then she said, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, I love like witchy things. And I've always loved, Halloween and the whole
Mm,
season. And she said, yeah, why don't you do something like that? So I did, and it was super fun. And that ended up being the first book that I sold solo. But then at the same time, I'd met a woman who Susie Palmieri, Susie Hayes, online. We were kind of helping each other out, reading each other's work. And she said, uh, we're both so stressed out because I had my witch book on sub with publishers. She had a witch book too, but for adults on submission with publishers. And we were waiting, and it could take a very long time to
yeah,
find out if your book's sold. And she said, you know what, I'm going to write you something. You can write me back if you feel like it, but I want to see what happens here. So she wrote me a letter as a woman on the home front during World War II. And it was so astonishingly good, and my character showed up like a gift to me. I wrote back to her. We ended up writing back and forth, and that was my first published book, which was I'll Be Seeing You, which was
right.
re-released as Homefront Girls. Um, so those books kind of came out around the same time, the Young Adult Witch Collector, and then I'll Be Seeing You, which they couldn't be more different.
Right.
But um, but the success of I'll Be Seeing You meant, okay, you're going to start, young adult can, wait, and now you're going to write more women's fiction. Um, and so that's kind of the direction I headed.
Sure. I'm glad you told that story. I was actually going to ask you about that just because, as you mentioned, there's so much waiting in the world of publishing, especially before you get discovered. Um, and it's just anxiety inducing, and it can be crippling for a lot of people, but it's sort of like kismet that you found somebody who, sort of sparked this creativity in you, and then a book came out of it and sort of a whole new career path, genre wise, which is really kind of cool.
Yeah, it was and remains the greatest creative experience of my life.
Yeah.
It was the most exciting thing, and I think Susie might say the same. It just worked so well, and it was so magical. And I don't think we could recreate that. Like it's just it was so immediate, and we wrote it so quickly, and we didn't break character. For the most part, we had to agree on major plot points, but overall, we just kept surprising each other with the letters, and I think it comes through in the book. I'm really proud of that book.
Yeah, there's so much energy in it, and I think when you're surprised, there's more of a chance that your readers are going to be surprised too. And obviously, it has spoken to people because it's been reissued a couple of times, and I think that really says something. So let me ask you: people a lot of times who don't write fiction will say, "Oh, fiction, what's so hard about that? You get to make it all up." But not true, because there's sort of an overriding sense of realism that you need to capture, and especially when you're writing historical fiction, because there will be those people who tell you every little thing that you get wrong. So can you talk about the research that you do and just how you sort of develop that overall sense of realism when you're working on your fiction?
Sure. It's kind of a two-tiered system. So I feel like I need to inhabit the person's skin. I need to know what kind of cereal did she eat in the morning? What color was her lipstick? What brand was it? You know, when she turned on the radio, what did she hear? What were her clothes like? What fabric were they made of? I need to know those specifics. And since Homefront Girls was set during the 1940s, I went to a number of antique malls, local antique malls, and was able to find so many women's magazines from the period. And I just whipped through those and just use those as inspiration. Better Homes and Gardens, Women's Day, they were just so full of detail of how women live day to day. Then I decided I needed to know exactly what was going on, not only in her small world, but in the greater world. So I did a ton of historical research on the war, what was going on day to day when she would be writing a letter on, you know, July 3rd, 1942. You know, I knew exactly what she was reading in the newspaper, what was going on in the greater world in the war. And then I also called the Historical Society in Iowa City, where my character lived, and asked them if there were any old timers around who remembered that time period and could give me details. And they hooked me up with a guy who was an amateur historian, and he had lived through World War II and had a fantastic memory of that time period. And I talked to him for a while, and he gave me specific, really specific information about her town. You know, what they sold at the deli, what, you know, kind of what rations were like then, you know, what was at the cinema, what was the local dance hall. It was fantastic. So yeah, a lot of work went into it. And then once you have that in your head, then it makes the writing so much easier, because you truly know your character inside and out, and her world. So so that helped a lot. And I know Susie also chose a very familiar place to her, for her character. So she had all that history already in her head. So I think it added to the richness of the novel, if I can say that. But yeah, but that's how we operate. And at least Susie and I, when we wrote the historical fiction together.
Sure, and those telling little details, make all the difference because not only are you inhabiting that world, but then you're allowing us to. And I think that's the, great escapism of reading when all of a sudden, you're in your house, you're in your bed, but you're somewhere completely different. And
Yeah.
until someone pulls you out of it and you just want to smack them.
Yeah, that's my job, you know. And I got to tell you, when the book first came out, I got invited to a book club as like a special guest, and this book club had been meeting for 44 years.
Wow.
And they were all in their 80s, and they had all lived through World War II, and I was terrified.
Sure.
I thought they're gonna point, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, and they were all like, oh, you got it right. So I was like, oh, it was just the greatest compliment and the biggest sigh of relief.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to jump ahead a little bit. So you had the Homefront Girls, and also there was another book with Suzanne Hayes, Empire Girls, and then you moved over to Lake Union, and you're writing what I guess they term is women's fiction, but I would say maybe contemporary fiction, just because it might be a female-driven book, but it can be enjoyable for anybody who picks it up. I think I'm the proof of that, but we have to classify things. So these books, to me, they seem to be, I mean, they're very much character and plot driven, but they seem to start with, an issue that you either experienced or something that's fascinated you at the time. So can you talk a little bit about how you're able to take issues that interest you and sort of turn that into these contemporary books?
Sure. And I think when you write contemporary fiction, you always have to kind of keep your ear open to what's interesting to people, or what people are going through. And I think these books kind of were born of conversations I overheard, or in fact, almost all of them, or things I noticed my friends were experiencing. But when Lake Union bought the first two, they called my books middle-aged coming-of-age novels. And I thought that was perfect, because that's what I'm trying to do here is I'm a late bloomer. And I think a lot of us are, or some people sometimes think that there's an endpoint to learning, to growing, to finding yourself again and again and again. And I think that that makes life a little dull and a little dim. And I think that we can always find a new life, or we can find something within ourselves that we didn't know we had. And I think that that's what those books are about. But more specifically, the first one, All the Good Parts, was about a woman approaching middle age who's told, if you want to have a baby, have a baby. Only she's not attached to anyone, has no boyfriend, and tries to pick someone to help her out from the men that she knows in her life. And then Digging In is about a widowed woman trying to find herself again. And the other family is about a woman dealing with her child's illness, and with coming to terms with her own adoption and finding family she didn't know she had, both related to her by blood and people that come into her lives that become loved as family. So yeah, so I guess the common theme is finding new joys in midlife.
Sure. Well, now you're just overachieving. I mean, you can say you're a late bloomer, but got a pretty impressive track
Yeah,
record.
but, I'm okay with being a late bloomer.
There's nothing wrong with that. You hit your stride.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me ask you a little bit more about the other family, since that is the newest book.
Sure.
At the beginning, you acknowledged that you've known, several people who have experienced sort of these mysteries that come with autoimmune diseases or disorders that a lot of times are really, really difficult to figure out if they even can be figured out. So can you talk a little bit about, taking these situations that you've seen that are very real and stressful and emotional and trying to do them justice in a book?
Sure. Yeah. Well, the idea for the other family came about. I was at a party a couple years ago, and everyone was talking about the 23andMe DNA test. I don't know if you've done it, but it was kind of new, and people were really talking about it, and everyone was talking about their results if they'd taken it. And there was one gentleman in the group who was kind of getting irritated, visibly so. And I'm super nosy, so I asked him.
Oh, you're a writer.
I know. And it turned out that he had an aunt he never knew about and cousins he never knew about, because his father had gotten into a huge fight with his sister before this man was born, and never spoke to her again, and never told his son that he had cousins and this aunt. So he was upset about it, and I said, wow, well, what happened when you contacted them? And he said, well, why would I do that? And I said, well, because that's the first thing I would do, right? So that was kind of like in my head, like, that's so interesting. And then I started hearing all these stories of people finding long lost relatives or finding out things about their family through this DNA test. And then at the same time, a number of children in my neighborhood got diagnosed with various autoimmune disorders. And my sister started therapy for her son who has an anaphylactic peanut allergy, as Kylie does in the book.
Right.
And then I started hearing more stories and more stories of people with all these different autoimmune issues. And I thought, what's going on? What are we doing to our bodies? And so I had that swirling around in my brain, and it came together, and the other family came out of it. And these are very difficult things to discuss, difficult things to write about. And I think what I try to do is take something that I think people might be interested in, but actually might be kind of a bummer, and add enough humor into the book to balance out that, that drama. So that's what I attempt to do, because I've written about like widowhood and, possible fertility issue, like, stuff that's not so fun. Right. But I think try to make sure that the characters are very relatable and very human. And, most people find a way to balance out the darkness with the light. So that's what I try to do. And that's what I try to do in the other family.
Yeah, and I have to say, you mentioned before, the importance of comic relief and how you try to use that in your work. And I have to say, it was surprisingly funny. Like, I was laughing out loud a lot, to the point where my wife, who was trying to sleep, is like, "Wait, shut up, and what's so funny?"
Oh, good.
But I also tell people all the time, when you've, lived through these very traumatic, trying things, I mean, a lot of times it is the humor and the laughter that keeps you a little bit sane. And when you can't laugh anymore, that's kind of a bad point to reach. So I'm like, as long as I can keep laughing, I'm going to be okay.
Right. I completely agree.
But I think you pull it across beautifully. So let me ask you a little bit more specifically about the book. So, middle-aged protagonist, a mom, Allie Anderson, or Allie Ackerman, as everybody on Facebook likes to call her, which that amused me straight through to the end. But she's going through a really rough patch. Her daughter is suffering through this mysterious illness. Her marriage is falling apart, and she's a hairstylist who feels like maybe she hasn't reached her full potential, even though we're looking back at her and she's really sort of like an everyday hero who's carrying her family through a very, very difficult situation. But can you talk a little bit about the physical and the emotional reaction on a family unit when you're sort of experiencing this very traumatic and mysterious illness together? Because we see that a lot throughout the book in the dynamic between the parents, what's caused them to break up, how they build a relationship going forward.
Well, as I started to talk to people whose children were suffering, it puts a strain on the marriage, and the divorce rate is actually a lot higher than the general divorce rate when there's a sick child, and that's an unfortunate reality. So I really felt an obligation to show that. I also wanted to explore divorce, even though I hadn't experienced it personally. Plenty of my friends have, and I've seen it where it was handled very well and amicably, and where things kind of fall apart and through whatever reason. And I kind of I thought from the most of the books I had read, there was usually a bad guy in the marriage. And really, in a lot of these circumstances, the bad guy is the illness.
Right.
And it just puts a strain, and then the marriage just doesn't hold as much as people try. And so I really wanted to explore that and kind of be fair to both sides. I think both Allie and Matt make good points all the time. They just can't see eye to eye, and they know that deep down that it's just over, and they have to kind of figure out a way to do that, to keep their child happy and healthy as much as possible given the situation, and to keep themselves happy and heart healthy as best as they can. And so I really wanted to try to do that, and I thought that I would do that through this Dr. Indigo, who kind of takes over consulting and advising the family. And I've always been interested in alternative medicine, and open to it, and so I wanted to make Dr. Indigo someone who's a little bit off the beaten path, because I think sometimes also when people are suffering these illnesses, they're so focused on finding a cure that they lose sight of a couple things. So I needed her to kind of remind them that there were other things in life and other things that you needed to pay attention to, not just the illness.
Yeah, yeah, she was a great character. So a couple of quick things to add to that. One, I just want to say it's funny that you had mentioned, that Allie and her husband Matt realize that there really is no bad person in this situation. It's sort of the illness, because when I was reading it, my thought was, wow, this is a very realistic to me, portrayal of a marriage falling apart where there isn't a bad person. It's so easy to say, well, this person cheated or this person did that, and obviously they're the bad person to this person's goodness, and there was none of that here. But I thought it just added a real depth and sort of complexity to the story that you don't always get. So I just wanted to say that I think that you pulled that off beautifully, because it actually was one of the things that I jotted a note to myself that I wanted to talk to you about, the fact that you had these two adults and there was not a bad person in the situation. It was just two people going in sort of different directions. But then too, you mentioned Dr. was it Ingrid? Indigo, sorry. And she is such a great character. And you really feel like you were in these therapy sessions with the family, and they are not traditional, and there's a lot of humor and comic relief, but also sensitivity and emotion. And I'm just wondering, is it a difficult balancing act to, take somebody into a doctor's office and go through this procedure that's, there's a lot of technicality to it, but you have to sort of portray it in an entertaining fashion?
Yeah, that was a challenge. because there are lots of things about the therapy. I mean, if I was going to explain it in full, it would be a textbook instead of a novel. So I had to kind of figure that out, knowing that I'd probably get hit by a couple critiques of, well, this is not, it's more involved and it's more, and you kind of have to take a little bit of creative license. I don't think I misrepresented anything, but I definitely glossed over a couple things. But I talked to enough parents that I felt like the details that I chose to include were the most appropriate details. And it's still a new therapy, so so that was kind of interesting too. But yeah, you don't want to. I didn't want to bog people down in detail and kind of lose track of the emotional journey, because the emotional journey was really the most important. The physical one just was kind of the framework that I used. So yeah, no, those scenes were probably the hardest to write, because I did want to make them somewhat lighthearted, but at the same time, it was a really scary thing.
Yeah.
If your kid could die from eating peanuts and you're giving them, 1/100th of a peanut in the hopes that their body will get used to it, but also knowing that there's a risk that their body could absolutely reject it, and can go into shock. That's a really heavy thing.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I think I always the balance is not even. It's always more humorous than not, but yeah, I tried.
No, it was great. I kept finding myself really, really thrilled every time there was a scene with Dr. Indigo. And usually that's not the case. Usually you're like, oh, it's back to the medical office. Oh, it's back to the doctor. Like these are the pages that you want to sort of gloss over. Um, but she was such a well-developed character. And, in addition to treating Kylie, it ended up sort of being like a family therapy too. And it was as beneficial, I think, emotionally to the parents as it was to the daughter, physically and emotionally. Which was pretty great. And to come back to the idea of family and biological family versus the family that you make or the family that raises you, sort of the other thread of this book is Allie, realizes that she sort of has to take a DNA test because she doesn't know who she comes from, where she comes from. And so she doesn't know what might be in her genetic history that's affecting her daughter. But of course, the ramifications of that go beyond just her daughter, because then she all of a sudden has this history and these people that she hasn't known. And she's being confronted with that. And it sort of assails the idea of family that her mother who raised her has. So can you talk a little bit about how that is sort of the other main thread to this story?
Right. Well, I wanted to kind of explore what family means, and how people in a family support one another during times of trouble, and how the family we choose can truly enhance and benefit our lives, just as much as our bloodline family. So that was important to me. And I've known a lot of adopted people. Some have decided to try to find their biological family. Some absolutely don't want to. And the ones who absolutely don't want to, they feel such a strong sense of loyalty towards their adopted parents, oftentimes. And I thought that was interesting. And there's a nobility to that. And I thought, she's torn. Her mother, who's not touchy-feely, demonstrative, but Allie respects her mom very much, and she loves her very much, doesn't want to hurt her, and at the same time is undergoing kind of a transformation. So part of that transformation is learning about herself, and in doing so, she finds this other family. And I wanted the other family to be interesting and diverse, and loving. I didn't want them to reject her. I wanted them to embrace her, and that almost makes it more difficult for
Yeah.
her, because she's got this new family she loves. She's got this old family she loves. Okay, how does she, as a new person, bring everybody together? So yeah, so that's I was very interested in that, and then again, like sometimes characters show up as a gift. Mickey and Bernie showed up fully formed, and I was like, okay, yeah, you guys are gonna run the show for a while, and I think I had the most fun writing Bernie, the 90-year-old woman. Um, so
Not to
yeah.
spoil anything, but the 90-year-old woman with the nip slip, that might get somebody else to pick up the book. But yeah, what a great
Her.
character.
I love her. So yeah, and the whole idea. So her Aunt Mickey, um, Allie's biological aunt, owns a place called the Not So Blushing Bride Shop, which is a bridal shop for women over 40, and that came from when I was getting remarried. I started to get all these people contacting me about brides over 40, about how difficult it was to find appropriate dresses and how do you have a wedding over 40 and all this stuff. And I thought, well, I never even thought that that was an issue, but I guess it is. And that kind of tickled me. So I was like, okay, this is what they're going to be into. And so Bernie's the not so blushing 90-year-old bride.
Yeah, she was a lot of fun. And like you said too, it's interesting, so Allie, of course, realizes she has this, family that she hasn't known about, and some of them are actually physically very close to her, proximity wise. And she does have to run the balancing act of, whether or not she wants to invite these people into her life, whether or not she wants to risk disappointing her mother, who, you mentioned she's not very demonstrative, but she's a very, very, sturdy person. You never, question her love or her loyalty. She's just maybe not as outwardly as emotional as some people would be. Um, but I think too, then there's that, doubt that sort of creeps up in Allie about, do I really want to meet these people? Because then I sort of have to confront the fact that they chose to, let me go. Am I not good enough
Right.
for them? So, as if her life wasn't complicated enough, as if she wasn't already a little emotionally overwrought.
Yes, exactly. Right. It's a complicated thing. All those emotions, and I think that was also a little bit difficult to write, was to kind of balance those out, all the emotions that she was feeling, and again, there's no real villain.
Right,
Um, it's just making, coming to terms with it in your own head. All of them had to. And I think Mickey's husband, I think, picks up on the fact that that might not be such an easy thing.
right.
It's
Yeah, he
just
was very enlightened. I enjoyed his character. But he had a lot of people to play to. um, but yeah, so before we go, let me just, if you don't mind, ask you a little bit more about that idea of what makes a family, because obviously, there's biological family in this book. There's people who are not biologically related, but who have served in that role. And then when Allie, meets her Aunt Mickey herself is sort of trying to integrate her own very unique family, which I thought was really fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about her family dynamic?
sure. Sure. So Mickey and Sandy Patel are trying to adopt a young girl who they're fostering. So she's Black, Mickey's Italian, Sandy's Indian, and they're kind of trying to form this unconventional family. And Rod is actually based on someone I knew years ago, who had unfortunately been passed through the foster care system and actually never got adopted and just kind of aged out. And it always kind of haunted me. Where did she go? What did she do?
Mhm.
And so that was in some ways my way of her name was Rose, my way of giving Rose a home in fiction. uh, and I just came to love them. And it sounds weird, when writers say that about their characters, like, oh, I love them. It's so cheesy, but it's almost like they become your friends. You
Sure.
know, you want to see good things happen to them. And so I wanted to construct a family that was diverse, that was a family that was chosen, and I wanted to phrase things as though it wasn't the parents necessarily choosing this child, we're going to adopt you. It was more Mickey saying, you get to choose us. You get to, the 16-year-old, you get to decide if we're worthy to be your parents. And in giving her that power and control that she never had in her life, and that was super important to me to express it that way. So hopefully it came through. But yeah, I love that little family.
Yeah, they were great, and I think too it made Allie a little bit more able to really consider the depth of Aunt Mickey's feelings. Because on the one hand, she thinks, well, your sister didn't keep me, but you didn't either. But then on the other hand, she sees this very strong, gracious woman trying to build her own sort of very unique family with the family that she's really made for herself. So I thought that was just really, really terrific. So let's see. I don't know if I think we've covered a lot. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about the other family, but if not, I'm going to ask you the dreaded question. This book, after all the work, the blood, sweat, and tears that go into it, it's finally out in the world. And then they say, this book was great, but what are you doing now?
I'm sweating blood. No, I am working on a book, tentatively titled The New Person. And it is about, it's an exploration of failure. Isn't that uplifting?
I
It's
know.
about, and again, we were talking earlier previously about writing during COVID and trying to figure out how to integrate that into a story. And this story is about a woman who owned her own restaurant, and the restaurant fails during COVID. And she's trying to find herself again. She's trying to launch this app. She has no money for it. She's working for an estate sale company doing estate sales. And she connects with a mentor. And he and his partner are looking for a surrogate, because they want to have a child. And she decides to be a surrogate for them, and all kinds of crazy stuff happens. So that's where I'm at right now.
Oh, that's great. Be looking forward to reading that. But it's funny. Difficult times sort of sometimes force you to be a little bit more creative and out of the box. And we were, as you mentioned, we were sort of having a discussion before we started recording about the strange times that we're living in and how that can affect your creativity and ability to focus. But as you mentioned, I think too, some good can come out of that if you're open to it and you keep perspective. Um,
Right.
so that seems like a very timely thing to be writing about. So we will be looking forward to that. But thank you so much, Loretta, for
Thank you.
that was
It's
my
been
pleasure.
great to talk to you.
I'm
Yeah.
so happy to see you virtually, and I highly recommend The Other Family. It's available now. Really great read, and thank you so much for visiting me virtually. This is, the most I've seen of people in a long time, so it's very exciting.
This has been really fun. Thanks so much, Jen.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.